welcome to Varn Blog Solo, and you're getting one of these rare extra solo recordings that I will do when my mind is on fire about something, and it is today. I have been thinking for a long time about the politicization of mental health and mental health terminology, going all the way back to the politicization and use of Freud, particularly with the Frankfurt School. While that history should be the history of many books, we do have to look at the current inclinations of society. While many academics may still be using Lacanian or Freudian language in the humanities in particular in critical theory and cultural studies, most of the rest of the internet, the world, and even activists have moved on to adopting language from mental health fields such as cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and more Gestalt trauma psychology, such as trauma-informed practices being spread on things like TikTok and Twitter. Now, I have to start a conversation about this with a lot of caveats. One, just like there's a difference between history and historiography, but one cannot do the other. One cannot do history without historiographic terms and terminology and conceptualizations. I am not speaking scientifically here, although I am basing my interpretation of anecdotal observations and cultural trends off of scientific data. So do not take what I say as something that is irrefutable or even could be refutable in all instances, because some of this is interpretative necessarily. Now, I'm going to go into more what I talk about with historiography and history and norms and descriptions and their complicated distinctions. While it's true that you can't conflate the normative and descriptive a la David Hume, it's also true you can't talk about the descriptive without normative commitments, because that's how you define your terms. All right. But I made an observation on Twitter, and I'm going to share my Twitter with you for once. That got really liked, and I also shared it on Facebook, and this was also highly liked and didn't get a lot of pushback. But because it's highly liked, I'm actually interested in maybe why. So I'm going to share this with you. So for those of you who are just listening on my Patreon, I'm also going to read this out to you. All right, we're having trouble here. All right. Young Zoomers and younger millennials mostly talk about friendship like a utility monster calculation, but one that only speaks TikTok therapy language. I can see no more pernicious a feedback loop on alienation. Now, this got 64 likes on Twitter and shared 10 times, mostly positively. That's not a good rubric for any truth statement. And what I wanted to talk about here is what's going on, because sometimes when people share this kind of work from me, they think I'm condemning younger people for faults of their own. And I made a bunch of posts about history, patterns in history, and the difference between pointing out a generational aggregate trend and blaming people individually for that trend. So while it may be true that individuals might be helped by ignoring a general consensus within a generational framework, we have to look at the material conditions and social incentives that lead to that framework being widely adopted. It's not just interesting to say that people are acting this way, but to ask ourselves, why would this be something that can catch on in aggregate? All right. What is useful and understandable in the individual is often different when you look at it statistically aggregately. And this one's a little harder because some of the terms that I'm using can't really be like statistically measured in anything other than an emic fashion, or as in trusting people self-reporting. And we'll get to the problems with that when I talk about David Graeber and his bullshit jobs thesis, because yes, it's relevant and we're going to get into that kind of thing. Now, the phenomenon of people, and my high school students do it all the time now, using mental health language, also often mixed with language from both legal activism, such as the diversity, equality, and inclusion movement in HR programs and human resources, uh, mixed with cognitive behavioral therapeutic terms and other terms from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5, has not been helped by video social media in particular, because the production values and lighting between a professional and a quote influencer are absolutely indistinguishable. The social flattening out is telling. It's not necessarily that we should trust the expertise of experts just because they make it, but we also shouldn't trust the expertise of non-experts just because they have good production values either. And the way to establish the difference in the space of randomly occurring talking faces at you, particularly on an app like TikTok or Instagram, or even maybe now Facebook, makes that very hard to do. Furthermore, a lot of therapeutic concepts that are perfectly valid, like trauma dumping, are people who tend to use their traumatic experiences and friends in a one-way relationship being extrapolated to, if a friend is needing with me and I am not needs me in an emotional way and I am not reciprocating, uh, at the moment now I am trauma dumping, really weakens the usefulness of those terms. We can even see this with other things that have a longer pedigree, such, for example, as the expansion of the category of microaggression, something that uh, is treated both as intentional and unintentional at the same time, as both a manifestation of explicit bigotry or ideology and in many cases an accidental implicit bias tick. While both things may be true, they have to be handled differently. And the use of the psychological term microaggression, is where it comes from, increasingly becomes used as a political category until its initial framework just gets lost. Think about the expansion of the term gaslighting from over the last 15 years, going from a specific kind of lying where one makes someone question their sanity by denying reality, to meaning either lying or just disagreement. It weakens the initial term. So even if you believe in the validity of the psychological terminology, using it this way is not helpful for it. But there's another point in there that I need to get to, and that is what I meant by a utility monster. A utility monster um, is about the calculation problem in utilitarianism. It's a thought experiment that was concocted by Robert Nozick. Now, he's a conservative philosopher, but I think this is actually useful. It's one of the implications of Marx's own critique of Bentham during Bentham's uh, during Bentham's popularity in English left liberal circles. So Nozick went to set out that, even if you value egalitarianism as a virtue, that utilitarianism cannot be egalitarian. Utilitarian theory is embarrassed by the possibility of utility monsters getting enormously greater sums of utility from any sacrifice of others than from those others from what these lose. The theory seems to require that we all be sacrificed in the utility monster's maw to increase total utility. This is what I like to also call the David Benatar argument, which is if you do the calculation where everybody else's utility is treated equally and nobody has a valid right to distinction between those utility, then everybody ends up eating everybody else and no one has any increase in happiness. Now, what I find interesting is that it could also mean that in this situation, people are encouraged to instrumentalize their relations with other people in this note of the utility of mental health and happiness in such a way that they actually cut against their own happiness by treating all relationships as instrumental. But what could possibly cause this, and why would this be more common amongst younger generations? See, this seems like a generational argument. Now, one, generations are not real. They are social categories whose origins generally come from marketing demographers, although sociologists have used them as well. But they do describe the experience of people who lived in certain time cohorts under certain specific material conditions. It is not surprising that, for example, baby boomers, while this cannot be necessarily traced back to any individual or even to certain subdemographics within baby boomers, are, in broad parlance, the richest generation on earth if they are in the Anglo American part of North America. It's a difference when you deal with other societies here. Even Europe doesn't quite fit this developmental trend. And that is because the 1950s and 60s were a period of particular largesse after World War II, given the specific conditions of World War II. Furthermore, people who existed in, quote, Generation X, who existed both in the political context of neoliberalism and don't remember any of the Fordist benefits, but also during the political environment and social environment of the 1980s and 90s, where many left-wing movements and even left liberal movements were failing from all kinds of different reasons, from collapsing incentives in the welfare state to seeming um, neoliberalization of social democratic polities in Nordic and Western Europe, to the capitulation of elements of left-wing movements in Latin America, to the, quote, global consensus, to the fall of the USSR itself, and the seeming neoliberalization even of, quote, communist, unquote, China after the Dengist reforms. You can see that a very specific set of social incentives that would disincentivize belief in any politics whatsoever, except maybe reactionary politics, would be somewhat endemic to a particular generation because of materialist reasons. Now, this is impossible to prove scientifically, meaning we can come up with many explanations for why this is the case. But even in a generation who is largely still with us, understanding the subjective processes of individuals as manifested into a collective understanding of themselves can't really be simply generalized in a scientific way. We can only scientifically understand what the incentives were that may make this interpretation more true and why this may have caught on, and our notions of that are going to be historiographic. They can be more or less scientific, but we have to explain the trends. Now, which means it's more interesting to ask ourselves why millennials, younger millennials who came up after the Great Recession, and in the advent of a different social media landscape than existed before 2008, aka, quote, Web 2.0, as it was called 15 years ago, would have certain incentives, and why people younger than that would think those incentives were historically normalized, and why they may even spread up to other generations that are highly participating in social media and exist in the same economic and job constructions. One of my theses is related to David Gravett's bullshit job thesis and my rejection to it. Um, I will link the work of Andrew Sanchez and I believe Sofa, who talk about alienation and the confusion of people's subjective feeling of uselessness in a field versus there being actual hidden social utility, which is not obvious to you because the social utility does not feel like it is in your favor. Now, the latter is typically consigned as one of the forms of alienation going all the way back to Marx, but as Moffat talks about, it is assumed in Weber and Kallenberg and Bailey and Madden and Budd. And I mention these sociologists and social psychologists because it was a near universal assumption. And one that is not uniquely limited to, say, political Marxists in any sort of way. So the question becomes, why are people who grow up in conditions of precarity, whose main way of making any form of living is through, quote, gig work or rent, or micro rent seeking, the commodifying parasocial relationships, who've also been told by activists, and for good reasons, that emotional labor is often abused and that many people are using your labor, your care labor in their lives in ways that aren't compensated, that maybe they should compensate and monetize all forms of social interaction. And if you look at the way profitability streams work, and I'm saying this as a person who actually has to do this myself to get a little bit of my side hustle money, one can see that incentivizing yourself as a brand and then monetizing that has become increasingly what has replaced open access culture, which was a older millennial and Gen X sort of prefigurative kind of liberation notice within capitalism that was actually highly generative of many things that we have today. Lots of technological innovations that were not done by the Defense Department or DARPA were also done in this open access way. And when they became to be monetized, we see that their functions start to collapse. But the monetization of mental health already exists because that is how we fund mental health care in most of the developed world. Not all of it, but even many social democratic countries leave mental health more to the private market than otherwise. I've talked about this in the case of Sweden in an interview with my friend Mir Ball. You can go check that out on the channel if you'd like. One of the reasons why that Andrew Sanchez and Maffa offer for why people increasingly feel alienated from even service work is that their profits from that service work are reduced and their hours of less are their control. For example, the experience of alienation historically has seen to be low in professions of teaching. It's hard to take people's knowledge and skill set away from them, and they can see the results of what they do in social relationships. But as the social relationship is more commodified for time, even in non-profit sectors of the government and economy, one can see these jobs becoming more and more onerous psychologically. Why do you think everybody hates teaching? But the professionalization and marketization of mental health and people's needs in this regard, and there are many needs, and that's where we're going to get to the scientific part, does seem to be something that is easily expanded in ways that create all kinds of celebrity and rent seeking. Now, rent seeking is a dominant part of our current economy, one that I think is created by a mixture of relatively low profit rates on traditional commodity production. While this is not true in the individual commodity, it does seem to be true in aggregate. Look at why the rates of growth decline over time in almost every society on earth that's capitalist. We also have to ask ourselves, um, what's going on with social alienation. Now, I'm going to start talking from reports, and I'm going to link all of the things I mentioned today in the show notes for this. But I want you to really look at this and think about why I think this may be aggravated by both our precarious monetary situation and by the way we are structuring our social world through mediation that is necessarily commodified. So we don't just view the internet as a source of this commodification, but since most of our interactions are mediated by the internet, we view our interactions as monetized in this way as well. And with other institutions, such as religious organizations, traditional civic institutions, etc., as from the show Anton Yeager has said in a piece on Robert Putnam, we can see that loneliness is driving this, and the understanding of why people are lonely is increasingly politicized. Leftists blame it on capitalism. Right wingers tend to blame it on left wing cultural norms. Something that has been a common enough pattern going all the way back to the 1950s that we can see that it is endemic to the modern economy. Daniel Bell was talking about it way back before most of us were born, including myself. But if we look at the Survey Center on American Life, we have seen a decline in friendship and social support across the board. It affects men more than women for reasons that aren't entirely clear. But it is consistent in both genders and in all races. Although, again, there are some other demographics from this. So in 1990, for example, 33% of the population reported having 10 or more relatively close friends. In 2021, only 13% do, whereas only 3% of the population reporting having no close friends, well, now 12% of the population does. That means about half of the American population, only about 51%, are satisfied with their number of friends when they talk about the results of that survey. Now, this comes from various Gallup polls and is composite. And it also indicates that the lower you are on racial marginalization, there's a slight tendency to be more satisfied with your friendships and to have more friends. Close to 6 in 10 Black people and Hispanic Americans report to be satisfied with the friends they have. Less than half of white people say the same, but both have been trending lower. This is also reflected in suicide rates, which have similar racial gaps. We see suicide for the last 100 years has disproportionately affected middle-class white populations, although we are seeing it grow in populations of color. Similarly, though, deaths of despair have been common, in fact, more common in communities of color, but have significantly increased, as well as a decreased prediction and standard of living in white, quote, middle class communities. Now, younger millennials and Zoomers are children, literally, of this environment. If you were born between 2000 and right now, this is the world in which you have grown up. Furthermore, before you go, but many people are satisfied with having no friends. Actually, the statistics don't back that up either. It is not surprising that Americans who have more friends report a higher level of satisfaction with the number of friends they have. The reasons for this aren't entirely clear. Some people blame the decline of churches, but why are churches declining? For example, many leftists, left liberals, will still talk about the rise of the religious right, and yet can't explain why church membership has continued to go down. Furthermore, what about these deaths of despair spreading? And is it COVID's fault? Well, every study I have seen says that a lot of these things have seen an almost exponential pickup in their acceleration rate, even stuff like declines in literacy post COVID, and particularly post the lockdowns, which makes sense. We can also see pretty clearly that these trends predate COVID. So, what do we is going on? I personally think it's a mixture of charity and the particular structure of the way we have decided to organize our social world through social media. And while some people might think that makes me a Luddite, I think everybody who used to sing that, say, online dating made people less lonely 10 years ago, and there was actually evidence to back that up, will say that it seems to have accelerated most of the worst trends and the most alienating trends of gendered interaction now. For example, men pursuing women is structurally set up in dating apps as part of their way to marketize loneliness. If you don't believe me, look at the way the pay structure works. This was not the case in 2010. The monetization of many elements of the internet that were not previously monetized really has changed the way this functions, and also lends people to try to get notoriety, maybe as a form of stolen valor, from that. And if you are taught by every social interaction that every part of your life can be commodified and you need income, why wouldn't you? Even if it makes you sadder, more lonely, and less likely to have meaningful relationships. Now, like I said, that last thing is an interpretive conclusion. It is not something that the science can solely back up, but it's one that I don't think the science disconfirms. And with that, have a good night.